Let's talk in more detail about the literature of the Perestroika period and of so-called returned literature, and about the new literature which appeared at that time. A huge boom, a huge surge of interest in Russian literature which aroused in that time was principally connected with the return of the previously banned texts. I must say that there has always been censorship in Russia, in Tsar's times and in the Soviet times. But still, the Soviet censorship is incomparable in its severity with its predecessors before the revolution. Censorship under the Soviet government was organized literally the day after the victory of October Revolution, or the October coup. And by the spring of 1918, all newspapers and journals had already been shut down, including those literary journals we were talking about last time. And in the beginning of pro-Stalinism in the 1930s, the Glave was an institution which engaged in censorship in the Soviet Union was established. It observed absolutely everything, down to match labels. That is, there was no printed output that this censorship agency could have somehow missed. What failed to pass the censorship? On this topic one can read a whole lecture. Of course, there would not go through the enemy literature that has anything to do with immigration, or the White Guards, or any of the pre-revolutionary parties. For example, under the Soviet regime, not a single line of the poet Nikolai Gumilev, who was printed. He took part in the conspiracy against the Soviet power, was shot in 1921. Or similarly, not a single line of General Pyotr Krasnov was printed. He was one of the leaders of the Whites in the Civil War, and later a collaborationist during the Second World War. It was not even permitted to speak about these people. But it was not only about the political opponents. It was about the emigrants, including so-called internal emigrants, those who, while remaining in the Soviet Union, did not share the communist ideology in one way or another. Indeed, in period of developed Stalinism, there appeared not only political censorship, but also the aesthetic one. The works unintended for publication then became any works that deviated from the canon, the very canon of the socialist realism we were speaking about in one of the first lectures of this course. Naturally, over 70 years towards the beginning of Perestroika, a huge layer of literature accumulated, which partly was self-published, but mostly remained unknown, inaccessible to the vast mass of readers who were eager to read it. After 1986, the glasnost, the politics of openness, was declared, and after 1989, we can already speak about freedom of speech. That is, absolutely everything could be printed, and there was no need to ask permission for it. What came back in these years? What ensured this enormous interest in literature? This was the so-called returned literature. Returned literature was primarily literature of the 20th century, that had already become classics long ago, but paradoxically was not printed yet. The poetry of Nikolai Gumilev and Anna Akhmatova, for example. Akhmatova's Requiem, written in the 1930s, when her husband and son were repressed. She did not even write it down, but kept in her memory and asked her friends to learn it by heart. These were also many of Osip Mandelstam's poems, a poet who was already repressed under Stalin. In prose, Mikhail Bulgakov, his early anti-utopias, which immediately gained immense popularity, especially after the famous film Heart of a Dog was shot in 1988. Many works by Andrei Platonov, including his novels The Foundation Pit and The Chevengur. Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, for which he received the Nobel Prize. It was first published in the Soviet Union only in this time, the times of Perestroika. All that can be called the classics of the Soviet era. The dramaturgy of Nikolai Erdmann, for example, his plays The Suicide and The Mandate, set in the theater by Vsevolod Meyerhold before they both, Meyerhold and Erdmann, were repressed. In addition, numerous works from the Khrushchev thaw era were published, which for many reasons could not be printed in time. Many works went beyond the borders of what was permitted, or were written in late 60s and 70s, where it was getting colder. These works include two Vasily Grossman's novels, Life and Fate and Everything Flows, and the fiction novelettes by Andrei and Yuri Daniel, for which they received sentences in the labor camp. We were talking about it in one of the last lectures. It refers, of course, to labor camp literature as a whole. Varlam Shalamov, Evgenia Ginsburg, Lev Razgon, and many others. Last but not least, the returned literature concerns Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, which was considered to be the most dangerous work of Russian literature for the Soviet power, the summit of anti-Soviet literature. Because the main thesis of this book was that state security bodies never ate their bread for nothing, and repressions must be counted not from 1937, as it was believed by many under Khrushchev, but from October 26, 1917, from the very beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution. The returned literature, of course, concerned immigrant literature. It was right then, for the first time, when the Russians read Nabokov. Before it, very few possessed his books, mostly old editions from the 1930s, or reissues of Ardis publishing house, which with great adventures were brought from abroad. Poems by Vladislav Kadasevich, Georgy Ivanov, prose of Boris Poplavsky and Gaito Gazdanov, and all literature of the third wave of Russian immigration, starting from the poetry of Joseph Brodsky, from the late works by Vasily Aksionov, who immigrated in 1980, such as his novel The Island of Crimea. Works by Yus Oleshkovsky, Georgy Vladimov, Sergei Dovlatov, a full body of works had come at once to the Soviet reader. Some of these works instantly became cult literature, like the works of Eduard Limonov or Sasha Sokolov. We will talk about the latter more later. This was the high point of Russian literature. This was a period of general interest in it, when people who usually never read anything became voracious readers. However, this process had its downside. Interest arose mainly in the literature of the past, written long ago, and dealt mainly with the history and socio-political issues. At that time, it was very difficult to make a debut. It was difficult to announce yourself, because being next to Nabokov or Brodsky, it was very challenging for a poet or prose writer to attract the attention of the reader. After all, the human circle of attention is limited. One cannot know everything. One cannot read all that is printed. Therefore, the names of the writers who became famous in that time are not very great in number. Who are these writers? At this time, Tatiana Tolstoy was getting famous, although her first works were being printed in early 80s. It was at the times of Perestroika that the works of Lyudmila Ulitskaya went to the reader. At the same time, Viktor Pelevin made his debut. Right at the end of Soviet period, he managed to publish his first works, even in thick literary magazines with huge circulations. Of course, we can talk about Vladimir Sorokin being printed, but the works of this radical postmodernist were not attracting attention yet. Another 10 years passed before his fame came to him. In other words, there were not very many of them. However, there were many of those who simply could not break through the onslaught of returned literature. The Golden Age continued precisely until 1992. In December 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. At the start of 1992, market economics appeared, and suddenly all the people found themselves to be poor, first and foremost. And secondly, they understood that former life, their education and upbringing had not prepared them for what awaited them in the future. People were kicked out of their former lives. And in the following era, the period of the 1990s, there was not many time for reading. Here lies the paradox. On the one hand, the new literature appeared, on the other hand, the reader had vanished. Look at this slide. You see graphs that visually depict the literary catastrophe of 1992. The volume of published books and journals became 4 times smaller, and the circulation of literary journals went from millions to several thousands, as it was in the 19th century. And with the irony of fate, it was at that time that literature completely changed its character. Here we observe this phenomenon. On one hand, there was heightened interest in recreational literature. This meant that literature has lost many of its functions that it had almost since the times of Pushkin. Literature stopped being a man's tutor, stopped teaching him, stopped being a model. It became recreation. On the other hand, there appeared a trend in literature which speaks about this, postmodernism, which has a playful character by definition. We will speak about it in more detail later.